Larry Len Peterson to Helena, Montana, on his way to Great Falls here the rest of the week. And his wife, Leanne. Where's wife? Where's Leanne? Hi, there she is. Good to have you all here. Well, let me tell you a little bit about Larry Peterson and what he's up to. And we're very, very happy and proud to have Larry here with us. Dr. Larry Len Peterson is an award-winning scientist, physician, and cultural historian and author. Above all, Larry is a searcher. I like that term. He grew up in Plentywood in northeastern Montana, north of Fort Union and next to the Fort Peck Reservation. He graduated from Oregon Health and Sciences University in Portland and completed his residency in visual field of dermatology. He has published numerous scientific and medical journals, but that's not why we're here tonight. He's also published several distinguished biographies, including those on Charles M. Russell, John Ferry, Philip R. Goodwin, L.A. Huffman, and many more. In its year-end Best of the West Collector's Edition, True West magazine rated Dr. Peterson as 2018 Best Author, and his American Trinity, Jefferson, Custer, and the Spirit of the West as the 2018 Best Nonfiction Book of the Year. American Trinity also received the 2018 Will Rogers Gold Medallion Award of first place for nonfiction. Larry's also the recipient of the C.M. Russell Heritage Award, the C.M. Russell Heritage Award, two Western Heritage Awards, the Scriver Award, the High Plains Book Award, two Will Rogers Gold Medallion Awards, and there's more. He was a member of the board of the C.M. Russell Museum in Great Falls, and are you still on the board up there?
Yes.
Very good. Larry's a great friend of the Montana Historical Society. Proceeds from his book, American Trinity, were donated to the Montana Historical Society Education Program, and the proceeds from this book are donated to Montana's museum here at the Montana Historical Society. So not only is he a terrific author, writer, scholar, researcher, he's very generous as well. On Saturday, Larry will be featured at the Educational Symposium as part of the Russell Weekend up in Great Falls. And there'll be this program on John L. Clarke, and there'll be some other speakers there as well. That will be at 9 o'clock at the Mansfield Convention Center. It's a free educational symposium as part of Russell Weekend, and we'll be there, and I hope you will too. But I'm really pleased that it feels like we're scooping the Russell right now, tonight, by having this here in Helena. So we are very, very pleased to welcome Dr. Larry Len Peterson.
Well, thank you, Bruce, and thank you for all your support. I've been waiting for this evening for a long time. The book is for, this thing's falling off my ear. The book is, for all you that love Clarke and for Clarke's legacy. But I'm really here tonight to celebrate my friend Kirby Lambert, and the book is dedicated to him. As I say on the dedication page, he's a great friend, great scholar, great supporter of the Montana Historical Society, and also a great supporter of John Clarke. And really in 1993, had the first major exhibition on Clarke here. And that was followed up in 2015 with Jennifer Bottomley O'Looney's wonderful exhibition on Clarke. And I was here for the Russell Symposium and saw her show out in the lobby there. I had no idea I was going to be doing a book on Clarke, but after I saw her exhibition, it was just, had to do it. So thank you all. And I know we've got a lot of mental firepower up there. There's some people that know a lot about Montana history and Clarke, and then there's others that are learning. But as the great C.S. Lewis said, we need to be reminded more than taught. So especially as we all get older. So here is the one of the first images in the book, and this is up at Jakers in Great Falls last March, And it was probably the hardest image to get for the whole book because we went all around inside. Jaker's trying to get a good photo, and then Becca, we went in the back alley and took this photo. All we need is the height thing on the side. It's kind of like a... So, and Jennifer wrote a really nice tribute to Kirby. It was very nice. Now, I'd like to thank a few folks. First of all, the Montana Historical Society. I got sent hundreds and hundreds of images from the Montana Historical Society, and some of the contributors to Jennifer's exhibition in 2015. And then also the C.M. Russell Museum was very supportive, and they have a great collection also. I'd also like to thank Kathy Springmeyer. Are you here? There you are. At Far Country Press, amazing job she did on this book, along with Shirley. I just can't tell you. The graphic design of this book is phenomenal, and I'm very pleased with the way it turned out. I'd also like to thank Brian Dippy, the Ultimate Russell Authority, for providing a foreword. Brian wanted you all to know that tonight he's in his man cave holding his Clarke bear in one arm and his Clarke book in the other, and thinking of all of you. And then Dana Turvey wrote a nice tribute, reflections to her grandfather, and also allowed me to get into the Clarke Turvey archives, which are incredible. I really didn't know that much about Clarke, which I love doing books where I don't know anything about these people and then find out. So, friends see the same truth and they share it. And these are two great friends, and I don't know if you all know immediately who they are, but this is May 22nd, 1966 in Hollywood, outside the home of Jodi Young on the right and John L. Clarke on the left. Clarke has about 4 more years to live. He just had surgery in Southern California for bowel obstruction, and his health was failing. But the truth these two men saw was the love for Montana, Montana history, art, and especially Charles M. Russell. Now, they both knew Russell about 12 years, and Jodi Young was Russell's only protege, and he went on to be a set and costume designer in Hollywood, spent most of his life in Hollywood. While they both knew Russell about 13 to 12 years, these two gentlemen were dear friends for over 50 years, and they were both deaf, communicated by sign language, and writing notes to each other. So they had a very close relationship. Here's Jodi Young in 1916 at Bullhead Lodge signing with Russell. Russell's legacy looms big over all artists that lived right after him and even today. And then this is my favorite photo of John L. Clarke in Spokane in 1920, kind of into his prime. Handsome John L. Clarke. So here's the question for everybody. How does a poor rural Blackfeet that's deaf and can't speak, and his parents are undergoing a divorce as a teenager, right in the middle of the Panic of 1893, they used to call depressions panics. How does he end up being the most famous wood carver in the country? And really, Jennifer and Kirby may disagree with me, I may get disagreements. I think he's the most famous Montana-born artist of all time. And I didn't think that until I started seeing all the press clippings and things. I think the family or someone along the line had press clippings from the last 100 years on him. I mean, it's just phenomenal what I found out about him. So here's the West that Clarke's ancestors, Blackfeet ancestors, supposedly lived in. This is Buffalo Hunt number 40, 1919, from the Tom Petrie collection. And I think when you look at anybody's life, if you look at your life, you always look not only what's present, but also historically your relatives and the culture they grew up in, because all that affects you. And so this is what we all think of as the West before the white man. But really, this sort of hunter-gatherer by horse was only probably 1 or 2 generations. The horses came up after the Pueblo revolt in 1680 from the southwest, and they moved up north, and the Indians traded horses between themselves. So really, by the time the Blackfeet get them, and these images are all Blackfeet. Blackfeet was images were the most popular for Russell, and Clarke loved that fact. The horses were really reintroduced to the Blackfeet in the 1700s. And you notice there's also that rifle there. Those came in from the Great Lakes and headed west. And so while you would think this is kind of like before the white man came, it really isn't. You have the horse from the Spanish and the rifles from the British and the French. This is Blackfeet burning the Crow Buffalo Range, another Russell. And all these images you'll see are in the book. And obviously, it wasn't a harmonious life out on the plains. The Crow hated the Blackfeet hated the Crow, the Sioux hated, and on and on and on. And it's typical humanity. Man is made of crooked wood. But these are also, all these images are of Blackfeet. Now, as Russell got older and felt his own mortality, he got into the nostalgia, and you can see in this picture Pagans, 1918. Russell's health is beginning to fail with a large goiter on his neck. And but this image is a wonderful image of the Blackfeet with the sagebrush kind of cradling them with the Missouri River and the butte behind. And if you look at the little boy there, he's got his finger up, and in Blackfeet that means yes. And so it's I don't know what they're talking about, but it's in his later life, Russell loved to do these nostalgic, romantic images. And just from an artistic view, Russell almost always had a white horse out front, and then the pyramidal or triangular moved back. So your visual is always to the center white horse, and then you go back from there. It's just an artistic technique that he used in almost every painting he did. Now, this is, once the white man arrives, the Americans, this is York, this is the Lewis and Clarke in what was supposed to be the Mantan village. And there's Lewis and Clarke and Sacagawea, Charbonneau, and York, the black slave of Clarke's. And I picked this one as the most intriguing Russell of all time. Now, most of us just kind of take it as it is. You have the elderly lady who looks like she's shocked, never seeing a black skin before. The chief is trying to rub the black off, and I think he might have some buffalo grease or something because it's white around there. So I think he's trying to use that like to remove the paint. And then curiously, you have this little boy here up on the pole because he wants to see. And where did Russell kind of think of this composition? And I really think Russell had dysgraphia. He had a hard time writing, and he had dyslexia. He had a hard time reading. When he and Linderman went down the Missouri in 1913, and Russell had Lewis and Clarke journals with him, he couldn't even read it. Linderman said he was like a little boy asking how to pronounce things. I think this image was inspired by the Lewis and Clarke or the Louisiana Purchase St. Louis Exposition 100 years later. You know, for you Clarke, or for you Russell nuts, you know that Russell, with the support of illustrators Marchand and Crawford, New York illustrators, went to St. Louis, went to the fairgrounds. He went there several times, saw the plaster structures of animals and some of the famous artists out in the sculpture gardens and inside. But interestingly, the main attraction at the Lewis and Clarke Fair, the Louisiana Purchase, was an ethnographic slideshow of people of color showing the superiority of whites. In fact, the setting is the same. You know, York here is almost like a zoo animal that was brought in. Little did the Indians know 100 years later, they would also be like in a zoo situation at the fair. In fact, they had an African named Oda Benga, and they put him in a cage with the monkeys to show how the superiority and how progression from a monkey and to this black African. And I think And the big attraction for the school children in St. Louis would they take day trips like all school children do to the fair, and they would laugh at the little black African in with the monkeys, and it was the biggest attraction at the fair. William Hornaday, who we all love, took the black African to New York and put him in the Bronx Zoo and put him in the cages and let him live with the orangutans and baboons. And I don't bring this in to show, just about the St. Louis World Fair. I'm just showing you this is the world that John Clarke lived. It was a racist and sexist society. And it got to the point in the 1900s, now this is when your grandparents were living, that they had eugenic boards. Montana had one in Boulder. And anybody that was undesirable, whether they're deaf or your brother committed a crime, they'd sterilize people for all sorts of reasons. And in the 1920s, there was a group from Germany, came over to Cold Springs in New York. Cold Springs is a big scientific laboratory now, and studied American eugenics, and they brought it back in the 30s, and then they were the Nazis and used it. The genocide took it one step further. So this is my vote as the most fascinating Russell of all time. In fact, I think the Montana Historical Society has the most important collection of Russells of anywhere, and should be very proud of that. And Kirby and Jennifer wrote an incredible book on the collection here. Very proud of them for that. So after Lewis and Clarke come the trappers. Again, this is from the Montana Historical Society, 1911. And this is my vote for if Charlie Russell had to come back. I don't think he'd come back as a cowboy. I think he'd come back as a free trapper. Some of the trappers worked for like the American Fur Company, Rocky Mountain Fur Company, Missouri Fur Company, and in Canada in the Northwest, the Hudson Bay Company that was founded in 1670. But these trappers, especially the companies, started building forts along the Missouri, Fort Union out where I grew up at the Yellowstone, Missouri in 1828, and then they started doing forts west from there to Fort Benton in 1847. And they were mainly later on into the buffalo robe trade, but these early trappers were into beaver pelts, and beavers were very fashionable around the world until the 1830s, late 1830s, and then silk became more popular, and the beaver population kind of got destroyed. These trappers were hardy men. They liked to get the beavers in the winter, and they had to trap them underwater. And they lived the life of a savage. They were the sons of Leatherstocking. They were wilder than Daniel Boone, and they married Indian women and lived the life of Indians. And as you know, some of you may know that Russell had on his mother's side, from the Bent side, family members that lived this sort of life. So I think Russell would have come back. In fact, that's probably Russell painted himself into that. This is what they came after. This is from the collection of Dr. Gordon Dutt, who I think had the greatest Clarke collection. Many are here, many are at the Russell Museum. And this incredible carving of a beaver is just amazing. We'll see the tail end of it in another photo. And I just wanted to throw, this is Alfred Jacob Miller, and this is called Thirsty Trapper. He went up into western Wyoming in 1837. This was painted in 1850. And just showing the generosity of the natives, and they communicated that way. Obviously, they didn't know each other's language. Legends of the Call Westerners with the Bark On. And want to thank Andrew Graybill for writing the fabulous Red and White that has a long biography on the Clarks. Malcolm, John Clarke's grandfather, Horace, his father, Helen, John Clarke's aunt, Horace's sister, and then Charles M. Russell, because Russell had a huge influence on Clarke, and I think Clarke had a larger influence on Russell than people realize. This is Blackfeet Storyteller. This is Howard Terpening, and Howard normally does not allow his images to be reproduced. Howard Terpening is the greatest living artist, I think, since Russell. And I like this because it's got 3 generations. It's got the grandfather, the father, and then the children. And it's interesting, the father is looking at kind of whether he's signing or just talking, and one of the children's looking at him, and then this one's kind of looking off into the blue there. So Malcolm Clarke, one of the most famous Montanans, famous Westerners in history. The West had a lot of characters with a lot of character, and he was one of them. He was born in 1870 in the Midwest, went to West Point, got thrown out twice for fighting, went down in 1837 and was with Sam Houston in the Texas Army. But by the early 1840s, he was traveling up the Missouri trying to seek wealth in the robe trade. And he would become buddies with Andrew Dawson. Their children would marry. He marries Kothkanona, I think, Kothkanona. I'll get to Clarke's name, and Kirby helped me with that. She's a full Blackfeet, or another name is Pagan, and they get married in the early 1840s around Fort McKenzie. Clarke did this carving decades later. She'll die in 1895. And their family, after Malcolm Clarke, John's grandfather, ends up murdering 2 people, finally gives up on the robe trade, heads down north of Helena here, and has kind of a way station. Things were going well there until August 1869. He and his daughter playing games at the table one night, 9 o'clock. Pete Owlchild, her cousin, is at the door with some other Blackfeet, and they think they welcome him in. Horace, John's father, goes out to round up some horses with another one, and the fellow, this is Horace, John Clarke's father, the Blackfeet gets his gun out and shoots Horace right below the nose. It goes in through the nose and out through the left ear. I don't know if that's why he had a mustache, but Tom Dawson had, I think it was fashionable for people to have mustaches. So Malcolm Clarke is murdered, and I believe he was foundational in starting the Montana Historical Society. Very famous. The people in Helena were upset, and there was Pete Owlchild and his other accomplices were indicted. Eugene Baker comes up from Fort Ellis next to Bozeman to Fort Shaw next to Great Falls. Horace, who got shot in the face, wants to avenge his father's murder, along with Joe Kipp. And so they go up and are looking for the murderers up on the Marias River, which is north of the Missouri. And the scouts try to tell Baker that the tribe that he wants to attack the camp is not the bad guys. It's Heavy Runner, who is a friend of the whites and actually has papers of safe passage. But he's drunk, and he attacks him in the winter in January 1870. Goes in and they murder him, cut him up, burn him. Children, old men, old women, all had smallpox. It was actually a smallpox camp. And Heavy Runner pulled out a sheet or his letter saying, "Hey, this is to keep us safe." And supposedly Joe Cobell shot him in the head. So that is the Baker Massacre, and the darkest day in Blackfeet history. After the natives are relegated to reservations, ushers in the heyday of the cowboy and the American Idol in the 1870s. Again, not a very long period, maybe a generation or so, of the open range. We get into that winter of 1887, waiting for a Chinook. A lot of the cattle get killed on the northern plains, and the days of open range are over with, and fencing and a lot of changes are made. A lot of people lose their money in the cattle industry. And this is my vote for the greatest cowboy painting. In fact, I think the Historical Society in every category has the greatest painting. Wait until I say that up in Great Falls. I think I'll tone it down. But there's something about this, and Gene and Bev light up because a lot of people think, including Brian Dippy, that this was taken from an L.A. Huffman photograph. I do too. There's something wonderful and lively about this painting that's just really special. So Horace, John Clarke's father, recovers from his wound through his head and goes up east of Great Falls in the Highwood area and marries Margaret Spanish. And from 1875 to 1883, they have 8 children, 1 a year. 5 of them die before adulthood, probably from smallpox. John's born in March 10th in 1881, only one of the 3 surviving children. And this amazing thing is called an amulet. Amulets are devices like crosses that are supposed to protect you from Satan and evil. And this is John Clarke's amulet. And these little, let's go back. These little attachments here are his umbilical cord. One of the most important women in John's life is his aunt, Helen, who is Horace's sister. And Helen was described as a 5'10" woman of magnificent stature. She was beautiful. She ended up going on to Broadway. She was very much in the idea of ethnic cleansing, killing the Indian in the Indian so that they could become Christianized and civilized. And she was highly educated, went to Catholic schools in the Midwest, and took part in the allotment program that removed reservation land from the Indians. She stayed on Broadway for a while with somewhat success. She was a mixed blood in the era of the Gilded Age, where there's social stratification, where the richer get richer and the poor stay where they are. People of mixed bloods, bottom of the barrel or below the barrel. So, and then she also had to fight sexism. So she had a lot of battles. In 1873, there's a panic, and she leaves Broadway, heads back to Montana, first to Fort Benton, then to Helena, and Wilbur Fisk Sanders, the famous Helena person, kind of takes her in as the daughter he never had. He has 5 boys. She becomes the first elected woman in Montana history, Helena, superintendent of the public schools. But since she is a mixed blood and they're looking for people to deal with the Indians on the reservations, she ends up down in Oklahoma Territory. The Dawes Act came in 1887, and that was the Indian Allotment Act. And what it did is it gave 160 acres to couples. The problem is 3 generations down, there's no land. And what happened, the Allotment Act started in 1887, but it went on until 1934. And in that period, 98.4% of all the Indian reservation was taken away from the Indians and given to the white folks. And she took part in this with limited success. The natives down in Oklahoma Territory, Indian Territory, Oklahoma now, didn't like dealing with a woman. She eventually ends up going back and living with Horace Clarke in East Glacier Park, which was called Midvale then. And this is John Clarke, I think's answer, saying that maybe someday justice will be blind, kind of the Martin Luther King feeling also. A Man of Timber answers the call. The life and times of John L. Clarke. He's now moved to Midvale with his mom and dad, Horace. And Horace and his wife are not getting along, and they're squabbling. They'll divorce in the 1890s. And in their home, they had an extensive library, probably thanks to Helen. John Clarke was a highly intelligent person, well-read. Since he couldn't appreciate the oral histories of Native Americans, he read a lot of different folks, avid reader. One of the artists that he admired a lot was Joseph Sharp, who had a studio at Crow Agency in southeastern Montana and also Taos. But he came up to Glacier Country a lot of times and would always visit the Clarkes. And he was deaf also, so he was one of Clarke's heroes. He was deaf since the age of 12 when he fell off a bridge on the Ohio River. So what to do with a deaf, mute teenager? Horace had a problem because he and his wife were getting divorced. They were living with Malcolm's wife, Horace's mother, who was described as insane. She would die in 1895. So they send, this is John Clarke. They sent him first to Devil's Lake, the North Dakota Deaf School, and he's there from 1894 to 1897. He goes back to Midvale, East Glacier now, Park. He's there for a while, and then he goes in 1898 down to the deaf school in Boulder in Montana. And in Boulder, they not only had the deaf together, but they also had all the children with mental problems. And so it wasn't a great situation, but he did have his first carving class there. Eventually, he gets to St. John's in deaf school outside of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And this is a Catholic deaf school. You can see the cross up top. This is certainly arranged by Helen. And he got his first dose of a lot of wood carving, and probably a lot of the Catholic churches around the country that have pews and altars and all these wood things were probably carved by these deaf students. And they trained him. They had the advantage of having some of the great wood carvers in the world, the Germans coming in. And eventually, about 1904, he left school and they placed him in Milwaukee, wood carving. And this is, here he's at probably the last year at the deaf school. St. John's was the saint of the deaf. There's John Clarke right there. This was a very long, big photo. I just did part of it. And here he is at Jakers in Great Falls, like we were. You can never find him when you want to see him, you know. But that's what I think of when I see this. But here he is in Milwaukee. Milwaukee was a great place for someone that was deaf and mute. Not only the great wood carving instruction, but it was a melting pot for people from all over the world that spoke lots of different languages. It was called the German Athens. And they were very receptive to people who were different, and he felt that great comfort there. They were also very proud in that city of people that worked for unions and worked with their hands. So he got a respect for being a manual laborer. And also he learned the good Midwest work ethic. So he was there until about 1910, about the time Glacier becomes a park. Heads back to Midvale to live with Horace and eventually Helen. Here he is hunting. There's Tom Dawson, who marries, that's his uncle. Another one with bighorn sheep. And he learned his carving firsthand. A lot of people did it from dead animals and didn't go hunting, or just from photos. But he learned to sculpt animals the right way. Here he is outside Tom Dawson's house. The Clarkes were on the one side of the railroad tracks in Midvale, and the Dawsons were on the other side. And I like this because it shows his hunting and then his painting and then his sculptures there. And they basically had to hunt and fish to survive. This wasn't just for trophies. Here's the Homestead House, which is north of Glacier Park Hotel, and there's now Helen's, the bird that has come home to stay. And she's there, and there's Horace. Helen would live until 1923. Horace would die in 1930. Now, some of you, I had to throw this in. I think everybody here has anybody not been to Glacier in here? Yeah. I won't spend a lot of time, but on Saturday there will be, including my son-in-law from North Carolina. So here's Midvale, which will be called East Glacier Park. The Blackfeet Indian Reservation is right here. And this is kind of blurry, but Two Medicine Lake is right here, and the Two Medicine Chalets. And it's about 10 miles between Midvale and there. That's where Clarke did a lot of his hunting and fishing. And then we get north of there, up towards Mini Glacier, and he would carve in a studio up there. All of the structures in Glacier Park were built by the Great Northern Railroad. This is Two Medicine Chalets, probably what it looked like. These were built in 1912. And here's Clarke hunting, probably poaching in the middle of the winter when he's not supposed to in the national park. Now, you can't talk about Glacier Park without talking about James J. Hill, the empire builder, who finished the Great Northern in 1893. It was the last transcontinental railway finished. And then his dutiful son, and I pronounce it Louis Hill. And Louis was looking for his own identity, because even after he built all the structures in Glacier, the articles would always say James J. Hill's son, or the son of James J. Hill. So he was in the shadow of James J. Hill. But Louis, if you love Glacier, you love it because of this man. He loved Glacier, he loved the Blackfeet. And here they are to show. There's John Ferry paintings all around there, and then there's 3 Charles M. Russell's 1910 oils. So most artists in their career take the slow stairway up and the elevator quickly down when their career crashes. Here's John Clarke, 1912. He takes the elevator up in a period so quickly that I don't think there's any artist in American history where this happened. I mean, I've just told you the history of him. He's not known. But this might look like a just regular group of guys, but it's the editors and writers from all over the country, from the New York Times, LA Times, St. Louis Dispatch, on and on and on. These were all brought to Glacier by Louis Hill, which the Saturday Evening Post called the greatest press agent in the world, and he truly was. And he brought them there so that they would go home and write about Clarke, but also write about Glacier too. And all of a sudden, within a year, Clarke is just like Charlie Russell. He's the native, with no training. He marries Dawn Mist, and all these legends and myths. And when the legends become fact, you print the legend. Here's, I think, probably the first time Clarke saw his dear friend Charles M. Russell. This is at the July 4th Browning celebration. Some heavyweights here. Frank Tenney Johnson, who after Russell dies will probably be considered the greatest artist. William Craigoff, Russell called him Duck Legs. He would do portraits of Charlie and Nancy and Little Bear. Charlie and Frank Linderman, the author, were the honorary guests. And Craigoff made Little Bear and then gave it to Linderman. Here's Jennifer's Joe Shirley. And then Percy Rabin, the head of the Montana Newspaper Association, who did all the great books, Backtrailing on the Old Frontiers. And I have a number of illustrations in there. But this, I think, John Clarke would have been there. I doubt they were introduced at that point. 1913, all the building, very noisy. It's not for John Clarke, who's deaf, but this is Glacier Park Hotel, Glacier Park Lodge. Originally just this structure. Within a short amount of time, the annex is added. And Clarke's first studio that we'll see next would be kind of looking across the railroad track at the lodge on Highway 2. This is the inside of the lodge. The trees are fir from Oregon, brought out on by railroad. And you can kind of see the Oriental design. In this period, the Oriental art was very desirable. In fact, the passenger train was called the Oriental Limited, not the Empire Builder, until like 1927. This is John Clarke carving there right after it opens. Great place to have a studio right where there's thousands of wealthy tourists coming. And this is his first studio on Highway 2. Really a nice little studio. Notice the sign. I'll show you one in 1962. It's the same sign. Almost, 50 years later. Doesn't look so good in 1962. In 1914, I think Hill sends out the biggest film documenter in the world. I think it's Pathé. I don't know if I'm saying that right. But they're out here filming Clarke for worldwide distribution for a carving that's at the Miracle of America Museum in Polson. It's called The Trapper. We'll show you a better image of that later. I think that's Tom Dawson, and this is in front of Tom Dawson's house. This is a promotional postcard. It was taken a little out of focus. 1915, Mini Glacier, Mount Grinnell, named after the father of Glacier Park. Many of you have stayed at Mini Glacier. These were the first chalets over here. And notice the footbridge. Originally, the road that goes over that area now was farther back, and they just had a footbridge over that. And Clarke would do carvings up at Mini Glacier on occasion. Louis Hill promotes the Blackfeet around the country. One of the most famous Blackfeet is Two Guns White Calf, and this is Two Guns White Calf and some of the wives and daughters. And the Oregon Journal was one of the big papers in Portland, and Sam Jackson owned it, and he was a good friend with Hill, and so he was very responsive to having these folks come to Portland. In fact, Clarke came there in 1915 and spent the winter there, and had a gallery and also had a show in the Oregon Journal building. It was a brand new building, still there with a big, beautiful clock on it. First time I started seeing these with the Portland thing, he wrote without an E on the end. So originally I thought these were like fakes or something, but Clarke, as his name was misspelled in a lot of magazines and newspaper articles, often it was Clarke with an E or not an E. So he himself even left the E off. I don't know if he's trying to be part of Lewis and Clark or what. So in May 1918, he gets married to Mary Simon Peters, who is from the Midwest. She kind of has a sordid past, kind of like Nancy Russell. And these two women were identical. Sharp business women. They were both called Mamie. Never had their own children. They had adopted children. And she was really the catalyst for John Clarke becoming even more successful. This is a photo of them in 1919. This is how he normally signed his name, but in 1918, Russell wrote him a letter saying that he should sign his name Cutapuis. Is that close enough? Blackfeet for the man who speaks not, and to celebrate his Blackfeet heritage. And he started signing a lot of his carvings with this and John Clarke. Here's just a couple images of Mary promotional photographs. Here's John Clarke up at Mini Glacier carving. 1918, his old studio burns down, so now he builds this studio on Highway 49. And if you go out the front door of Glacier Park Hotel and walk down the road a little ways, this was his studio. So tourists by the tens of thousands every summer could go in that little studio and buy a little carving to take home. This is called Handsome John L. Clarke. He starts embracing his Blackfeet heritage even more in this period. And this was stimulated by some of the great writers like Frank Bird Linderman, Indian Wise Stories, Indian Old Man Stories, James Willard Schultz, Walter McClintock, George Bird Grinnell, all wrote about natives, and Clarke read all these books. One of his big heroes was Will Rogers on the left here, and there's Charlie Russell on the Goldwyn Studio lot in Hollywood. He's filming Poor Relations. Will Rogers is a very important person in not only Russell's life, but also Clarke's life, because he would head up the memorial exhibitions after Russell dies, where Clarke really gets to see a lot of other artists and carvers in Great Falls. Just to recall, I think a lot of us are old enough to remember when Will Rogers was a big deal. I certainly was where I grew up. And he had circulations in the New York Times. His columns were 40 million people in the country read him every day. Most famous man easily in the world. and really was a great friend with Russell, and a great sense of pride being Cherokee from Oklahoma for John L. Clarke. Another interesting connection here is Warren Harding comes to Butte in 1924 on his presidential re-election tour called the Voyage of Understanding, where he goes around the West, Canada, and Alaska, mainly trying to trump up votes. He takes small weights like Thomas Edison, Henry Ford, Harvey Firestone, Douglas Fairbanks Jr., Mary Pickford, actor and actress, the most famous actor and actress in the world. And here's Russell shaking his hand, and is given where the best of writers quit, a bronze of Russell's by the Shriners. And a number of papers, Harding didn't make it to re-election because he died about 3 months later in August in San Francisco. And a number of papers, independent papers, said that Harding also owned a Clarke of an eagle with a flag. And Charlie Russell had a number of Clarke carvings also. Here's John Clarke carving fighting buffaloes, and little did he know when he was carving that the richest man in the world was coming to see him, John Rockefeller Jr. Now, just to remind you, John Rockefeller Sr. started Standard Oil. He had control of 90% of the oil in the world until 1911 when they broke him up, and it even made him richer. He had more money than the entire U.S. budget, so actually 50% more. So imagine, I mean, all of our billionaires today could use their money for like his cigars. He was that wealthy. But the John Rockefeller Jr. with his 5 children, Nelson Rockefeller's one of them, and David Rockefeller's another, they come and visit his studio and buy a number of his carvings. And Rockefeller got in with Louis Hill to promote Clarke. There were a number of articles put out by the government even about famous John Clarke. I mean, all of a sudden he's like the most famous, carver in the country. It was really quite amazing. This is a vintage photograph of fighting buffaloes that the Rockefellers had. Lauren Penske had some of these images, and I worked with the Rockefeller people at Rockefeller Plaza in New York to be able to reproduce these. David owned this, and he died 2 years ago at 102, and they sold a lot of their art last year for $865 million, all donated to charity. This was actually given to a museum, but they couldn't tell me where it is yet. Long Winters of the Sign Talker. This is breaks about where Russell dies up until where Clarke dies. One of the great controversies, and this should get Jennifer going, is the Great Northern Goat logo. And the controversy lasted even after Clarke was dead in 1970, that a lot of people felt that Clarke should have been credited for this logo, and wasn't. And this is a 1927 advertisement in the Great Northern Goat magazine. And it shows a John Clarke goat. And so a lot of people said, well, since this is the goat at the Great Northern, then he's the one that should be given credit for the goat. But a couple of years ago, Tom Minkler found this in Joe Shirley material, which I guess, Jennifer, you have out there? I haven't been able to see it, but this about knocked my socks off. A lot of stuff fell in place on this book that I just can't believe. But anyway, this is the goat logo. Now, there were, you Great Northern aficionados, there were 2 Great Northern symbols in 1921. This was used from 1922 to 1936, and then they had another one until 1967, until the Great Northern turned into the Burlington Northern, and then the Burlington Northern Santa Fe eventually. So the question is Clarke responsible for this? And I really don't think so. I think a lot of organizations, the Mazamas Hiking Club in Oregon used a goat. I think, and if you spend time in Glacier, the goats are everywhere. So I think they're kind of the symbol of the mountains. And I think the connection is Clarke painted, his most popular carvings were goats because all the tourists wanted a goat. I mean, they could see a deer or a horse, so the goats were very popular. In the mid-20s, Louis Hill starts bringing in other artists. He wanted an artist to paint the Blackfeet, and that's the famous Weinhold Rice German. And here he is with Frank Linderman, the great writer, one of John Clarke's heroes. And then Carl Link, who's an artist at Goose Bay on Flathead Lake where Linderman lived. One of the great connections with Weinhold Rice and the Clarke family is this is John Clarke's niece. His brother Malcolm lived on the reservation, and this is his daughter. And this is what Weinhold Rice's interpretation of it. Now, interestingly, Aggie, or what's called Aunt Aggie Judge, she ends up going to Southern California, doesn't want anybody to know that she's got any Blackfeet in her. Not good at that time. And so this never ended up, to my understanding, on any calendars. You know, these Weinhold Rice calendars were made by the tens of thousands. And but Tom Dawson one was. This is from 1949. This is in the Montana Historical Society collection. Elizabeth Lockery was an artist from Butte, married a banker, and she went all around Montana painting the different tribes. This is her rendition of John Clarke in 1944. And then this is her rendition in 1961, and this is on the frontispiece of the book. I love this image of him. Now, one of the great events in Clarke's life was the Russell Memorials. A lot of you that go up to the Russell auction think it started in the late 60s, which is incorrect. I've never, ever seen any publication or biography or anybody write about this. But in 1927, 6 months after Russell's dead, Will Rogers flies into Great Falls, parades thousands of people, every artist you can think of, from L.A. Huffman to Seltzer to William Standing to a young Earl Heika, the great clay sculptor from Great Falls, Shorty Shope, Branson Stevenson, William Standing. They're all there, not just their paintings. These people are there. So Clarke gets to spend 3 exhibition memorials in 27, 28, and 29 with all these people. And it was a great learning experience. This is, of course, Charlie, about the year he died. And then this is Sid Willis, who was instrumental in putting on these exhibitions. Sid owned the famous Mint Saloon, and his collection ended up at the Amon Carter. And his saloon was more like a museum full of Charlie's works. Now, this is really interesting. Emily Wilson sent me like 90 pages of transcription from the Great Falls Tribune. I mean, it was incredibly covered. Fascinating to read. Never seen it. So for the first time, to my knowledge, part of it is reproduced in the book here. Mainly I did on Clarke's entries. And no artist there got the term famous except John Clarke. And famous woodcarver, guest at art exhibit April 2nd, 1927. John L. Clarke of Glacier Park, widely known for his wood carvings, arrived in Great Falls Friday to attend the art exhibit sponsored by the Chamber of Commerce. Many pieces of his work have been purchased over the country and now are owned by Eastern art galleries and art collectors. Several of his carvings are on display at the exhibit and are attracting much attention. Clarke, misspelled. A part-blood Blackfeet Indian, has been unable to speak or hear from birth, which isn't correct. He got scarlet fever when he was 2 years old. During this period, I just want to show you a couple pictures of Clarke signing with his wife, Mary, or Mamie. And all is happy until the Depression hits and the stock market cans it in October 1929. Now, Carl Sandburg said that babies are God's opinion that life should go on. And that was certainly true for the Russells during World War I. They were at home. Russell wasn't doing much. The country pretty much shut down. As you might know, the United States didn't get into World War I until 1917, but it's still, even before that, when it started in 1914, the country kind of closed down. The Great Northern was taken over by the government. Louis stepped down. He didn't want to deal with them. And this is Charlie and Nancy with their adopted son, Jack, who they adopted. He's about 3 or 4 months older. This is in January 1917. Charlie and Nancy are older. Same thing here. Depression. Let's have some hope. So they, Clarke and Mamie, adopt Joyce. And probably a lot of you know have no Joyce. So this is one of the earliest pictures of Joyce. She was adopted from Helena when she was 2 years old. During that period in the early 30s, Hill continued to promote Two Guns White Calf like he did in Portland. And on a lot of material, Two Guns White Calf was supposedly the model for the Buffalo Nickel, but that's a story I can't go into there. Clarke said Two Guns White Calf was the most important person to ever come in his studio. This is my pick for the greatest painting of Blackfeet in Glacier National Park. This is Oscar Burninghouse, who was a Taos artist, and this is actually from a photograph. He didn't do this on site. And there's Two Guns White Calf on the horse. It's just a gorgeous painting. This is John Clarke's version, large version of Two Guns White Calf. That's his smaller plaster version. Two Guns White Calf, like a lot of people I could list, died in the Depression. You know, loss of hope kills. But Clarke had hope through his little girl Joyce. Here he is with one of his little elk that we'll see later. Joyce has a little doll. Pretty soon she'll rather have her hands on those carvings and not the doll. She brought a lot of joy to John and Mamie. So the Depression drags on. FDR gets elected president, and they start the WA projects. Montana was the recipient of the most money other than one other state, the most federal money. And one of their projects was building a new hospital in Browning, the Blackfeet Hospital. Clarke was given a commission. A lot of these buildings they had built, they'd also, like they do today, have artists do some work for it. And these were a couple friezes that were done. It was a surround for the front door of the hospital. This is the left panel, right panel. There's a panel over the top. And Mamie complained that it was good work, but didn't give him much income. Albert Racine was a Blackfeet Indian on the reservation who was a student of John Clarke's, and he helped restore those panels that you just saw. Years later, they built a new hospital in 1968, and they were put inside. But originally, they were outside, and they got weathered, and the vandals worked on them. And this is a carving by Albert Racine, a dear friend of his who was his friend until the end. William Weatherwax was another Blackfeet who was fairly well-known artist. None of these artists are well remembered today. And then many of you think of Ace Powell as a painter, but he also took instruction from Clarke, and he was probably a better carver than painter. Don't want to offend anybody. And here's Joyce, middle of Depression. They have no food, no money, hardly, cold winters, and but she doesn't have a problem. She's got her own zoo. This is the first color photo. Kodachrome film came in about 1930. Any color images you see before then are hand painted or hand tinted. But here's Joyce growing up in 1939. Another WPA project was the Museum of the Plains Indian in Browning. And Clarke did 2 panels for the entrances to the front door. This is a promotional postcard. L.A. Huffman is the one that was the great postcard maker, and I think Clarke kind of took a cue from L.A. Huffman. Bev and Jean let everybody know about that one in their fabulous book on that. But Clarke would do these postcards and sign them, and then they'd send them all over the country. This is another one of the panels. In the war years, he spent a lot of time in Great Falls and Helena. Bob Morgan met him first at a department store here in Helena. But this is a free class, and it says down here, all you need is your jackknife, and you can just carve like him. So the war ends. Happy days are coming, but not for Mamie. In 1947, she dies of heart disease. She'd been battling congestive heart failure for a few years, so John was again on his own, but a man with the bark on continues. He's still celebrating his Blackfeet traditions and heritage, very proud of that. As we get into the 1950s, everything American West is hot again. A lot of the museums are formed. The Montana Historical Society builds a new building starting in 1950. Russell Museum opens up, and I can go down the line. It was the Westerns, the TV movies. The West was hot. And so there was a renewed interest in the parks at that time. There was a wealthy gal from Tacoma named Irene Blouse who really took a liking to Clarke, and she made these brochures up, sent them to Clarke, and then he sold them in his gallery for $1 a piece. This is Clarke's personal booklet, and I think it's kind of fun because it shows Joyce and her husband Irv, who ends up dying in 1969. And this is Sharon, their oldest daughter, born in 1959. And then Dana was born a few years later. She's going to be at the talk in Great Falls. I better not say what year she was born. She'll probably get mad at me. But this friendship with Irene Blouse lasted a long time. Even in 1966, she's saying yours for keeps. I think Dana feels that they had somewhat of a romantic relationship. So, new building here. The Mabel Bork, who's part of the Montana Institute of Arts, champions Clarke getting a commission to carve this beautiful Blackfeet encampment, 4 feet by 13 feet, 8 inches thick, and Clarke does the carving right in the lobby here so that people around Helena and tourists can come in and see it. And it's right out there today. It's an incredible carving. And interestingly, it was done in 1956, but he didn't get paid until 1959, totally. Budgets, right? Budgets. Indian Hunter's Return is, I think, definitely in this, and it's in the collection here, is definitely the inspiration for that. You can compare it. There's a lot of things going on that are similar. And interestingly, for those of you that know Ginger Renner, the great Russell authority, this was her favorite painting. And she had it on her business cards. So another plus for the Historical Society. Just want to mention Dick Flood, one of the great collectors of Western Americana, great friends with John Clarke. This is a letter that Clarke sent him in 1959. And Clarke would often draw these drawings on to possible patrons on what he wanted to carve for them. And at the bottom there is how he started signing his name. This is what his studio looks like in 1962. Not good. And so it's deteriorating. He had a fire. The homestead where Horace and Helen lived, it burns down in 1962. Gordon Dutt becomes the big collector of Clarke material. There's the beaver tail right there, and there's a cougar that we'll see later. And unfortunately, his family saw to it that a lot of his greatest carvings were donated to the Historical Society and the Russell Museum. And doing this, I was surprised, and I put in all the people that gifted this and how important it is to gift to the Historical Society. And it can be eventually seen in this sort of presentation. And I think we had 37 different sources for images, and within those sources, like the Montana Historical Society, there were probably dozens of people that donated all these carvings. So it really is beneficial. Now we've gone full circle back to 1966. And we've added, there's Jodi Young again, and here's Sharon Dana Turvey, who runs the Clarke Gallery now up in East Glacier Park. This is Joe's mother, Mary. She's in a lot of the old Russell vintage photographs. She lives to 100. And then here is Clarke in the last year of his life, full year in 1969. He'll die in 1970, next to Albert and Inez Racine, his dear friends. And it may be kind of fitting that towards the end of the 60s, it maybe was time for John to go. You know, he was born in a world that was only lit by fire in the 1800s. There was no electricity, you know, most rural Montana, and electricity was really a novel thing at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. That's why they called it the White City. And so he was born in a time before electricity, and then think of all the things that he saw in his lifetime, from TV to movies to planes. In 1969, the men land on the moon. I mean, he saw all this. It's just amazing. And it's also, 69 is kind of an interesting year for movies. The Midnight Cowboy, I think you might remember that one. That was the only X-rated movie to win an Oscar for Best Picture of the Year in 69. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid in 1969 was the last Western to be the biggest box office hit of the year. 1969, True Grit, John Wayne finally gets his first Oscar. And then The Wild Bunch also. So some of the great Westerns were that year. So John dies in 1970 up in East Glacier Park of pneumonia, bowel obstruction, just general wasting. And eventually Joyce comes back in 1977 and opens up the gallery again after Irv dies. And then the great Kirby Lambert puts on the great Clarke exhibition of all time in 1993 with the help of Joyce and I think Bob Morgan. That's followed up in 2015 with the great exhibition by Jennifer. John Clarke is also placed in the Hall of Great Montanans with a lot of really famous Montanans. During that show, they finally get Blackfeet encampment back. This was actually sent to the field house at the University of Montana because it didn't fit where they wanted it to and at the Historical Society here. Then it ended up at the Deaf School in Great Falls, and they had a little tussle getting it back here to Helena. And this is Joyce, as many of you probably remember her, in 2007, and she would die in 1913. Now, I thought I'd just go through some quick images of his art. This chapter has like 235 images in it alone. So we'll just go through some. The goat is his most popular. I think the buffalo is a salute to Russell. Love this photo of all different sizes. He did a lot of quarter-size mountain goats and bighorn sheep. Some of them ended up at train depots and the Great Northern train depots in their offices. This is from Jennifer's exhibition in 2015, these beautiful images. Glacier County Historical Society up in Cut Bank, I think they own the workbenches. This is interesting. A lot of you that collect Clarke things probably say, gee, a lot of his bears look just alike. Well, he used a duplicator, a machine that would duplicate them, which was news to me. I don't know if Kirby and Jennifer, if you knew about that, but this is Van Kirk Nelson, who collects this sort of stuff. Gave me a bunch of great stuff. Here he is putting the finishing touches on a bear. This is his salute to Earl Heika, and Earl Heika was so famous for his pack trains, I believe. This was owned by Lloyd Morton in Great Falls, who was a kind of a semi-pro wood carver. And there's Lloyd Morton and Clarke. This is in the Russell Museum. Elkin Lake, Montana, one of Russell's most famous watercolors, and these are Clarke's elks. This is the one that Clarke was holding in that one picture with Joyce. Charles M. Russell buffalo hunt, and this is Clarke's buffalo hunt. It's in the Russell Museum. That was owned by Dutt. And then this is Fighting Bulls. This got donated exactly when I needed to put an end sheet, so this is on the end sheets of the book. It looks great. We did a gold background on it. Far Country and Kathy and Shirley did an incredible job. It was quite the technique. It had to be, it's a very technical thing. You just don't lay that on gold. Just some more of his buffalo. And of course his bears. I think he probably did more bears than anything. And this is all one piece. It's amazing. I have one of these, very similar to this. And, you know, it's like he didn't just set those in there and glue them in. Did lots of bear lamps, some from the Great Northern, although late in his life, the Great Northern denied that they had ever purchased any lamps. But they used to sell these in the lobby at Glacier Park Hotel. Grizzly Gas, I guess the sign is still up there in East Glacier Park. I haven't seen it. This is an endearing one of them. You see the mother bear licking her little cub who was nursing. I always have to bring out one of my heroes, Philip Goodwin, America's sporting and wildlife artist. There's Deep doing that. There's Phil Goodwin, the great animal painter, Carl Rungus, Jimmy Simpson in 1911 in Banff. So there was no one that probably influenced Clarke more than Goodwin, and Charlie Russell idolized this guy. Goodwin illustrated Jack London's Call of the Wild, Theodore Roosevelt's African Game Trails, was the main illustrator for Winchester, Remington, Peters, the horse and rider logo, which is probably the most ubiquitous logo until the Nike swoosh. His art was in every home and every downtown in the country. And Clarke had a ton of his prints out of magazines and stuff. This is one of them. Here's Clarke in his studio. And when I saw this picture for the first time about drop, that's a good one called Who's Coming that was first showed up in Scribner's in 1907. This is another good one. This is his most famous one that you would probably have up in your hardware store or in your house. It's a bear, the two fishermen, the bears come around the corner. This is a fun one. Now I saw this was in Jennifer's show, and immediately I thought, I knew that was a good one, because here it is down here. This is the painting, and I have personal experience with this. When I was doing the Goodwin book, and I photographed that whole book with two little bags and a camera, I went to Northern California, and I walked in the room, and this was up on the wall, and a bird had flown through it, and there was a hole through it right here, which was repaired before they sold it at auction. But it was also in printed books and magazines in 1914, and obviously Clarke copied that exactly. Goodwin also did a bunch of trapping images, and notice the bear's arm right there, and then same deal, and that I'm sure is Tom Dawson for sure. Lots of goats. This is the Warren Hanna goat, the great Warren Hanna, writer on Glacier. Completed at Mini Glacier in 1918, and it's the cover of the book. This is Gene and Bev Allen's goat, and since they're adopting me, they said they were going to give this to me. And I don't believe in writing down stuff, Gene and Bev. I'm going by your word. This is a picture of the goat, Bev and Gene's goat, with Clarke. Did a lot of beautiful. These are from the Montana Historical Society show. Great. Tom did a great job on the photography. Proud Bighorn. Fabulous. There's a little antelope. This is a Charlie Russell watercolor that he did for Elizabeth Greenfield when she was a little girl. And this is Clarke's rendition. He also did a few moose, not too many. They weren't as exotic as some of the animals in Glacier. And then a whole host of different animals. This is that one that was in Dr. Dutt's photo of the cougar. This is a really fascinating one to me. This looks like an Art Deco one that was done in the 30s when they built the Chrysler Building and the Empire State Building. There's just something different about that. Clarke didn't do too many like that. He did bookends. And then this is the Indian lamp, and it's got three sides. These are two sides of the shade, and the other side is on the back of the dust jacket. And all of you that know about Clarke, I've never seen another lamp that had a Blackfeet Indian on it. This is the only one I saw. And then we have about 35 or 40 of his paintings, just to give you a taste for that sort of artwork in it. In the end, Cutapuis was the wood, and the wood was the word. Thank you.